I will be taking the next 45 minutes to provide you with one glimpse of the congregational landscape. And the congregational landscape, I realize from my view now, is that I'm often in the pew. And I'm also guest preaching or traveling or consulting. But I only have one landscape, so I look forward to our dialogue yet today about the view from your place. And I stand here among giants, and I'm very privileged to be among you. Well, what I'm going to speak about today is a conversation about how to create a shameless congregation. I don't use that word shameless the way my grandmother used it when she saw me one time as a teenager and said, "Honey, you look like a shameless hussy in that dress." Or as a colleague of mine recently quipped, "We have enough shameless pastors." I am putting a hyphen in the word. What we need is shameless clergy and shameless lay leaders and shameless congregations. I am writing now for Alban a book on replacing shame with grace. And in it, I make a case that our congregations are critically ill because of the overgrowth of what we might call the bacteria of shame. In the next 45 minutes, I'll be making a case that you who are on the front lines in the healing of abuse and abuse prevention are uniquely positioned to create shameless congregations. At the university where I teach, I was sitting with a 22-year-old budding psychologist, a Christian I'll call Amanda. And Amanda was telling me about her search for a church. "I never felt welcomed in the congregations I visited," she said. "As I walked in the door," she said, "they looked at me, they were somber. I saw aging congregants. I saw squinty-eyed stares." She said, "It's like they were suspicious of me." Well, hoping against all odds, I asked her to say more. Well, here's the summary of what she said. Well, she opened the bulletin and found out that the bulletin was in code. Here is what it said: "A luncheon will be held by the UMW in the FSH. An adult study class on EPH will be in the FSR. An upcoming retreat for the UMYF and the trustees will be happening in the FSH." Well, that was about it for Amanda. She said that the hymns reminded her of her grandmother's funeral. She texted a friend during the service, and her friend said, "Where are you?" And this is how she replied. This is the embarrassed emoticon. Well, she got to the sermon, and the preacher said, "May the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts, O Lord, be acceptable in your sight." And she wondered if he sometimes made unacceptable comments. And just before communion, she was sure she heard him say that they were all unworthy to come to the table, but she knew that some of them were going up there anyway. She sometimes stood up when she should have been sitting down and vice versa. She did not know the rules, and she was in an entirely uncomfortable experience. Her words, "They were suspicious of me," have haunted me. Because I believe without knowing it, the congregations are sending out messages of shame. A colleague of mine, in reading this draft, put a note on the side and said, "Aren't we getting to shame a little quickly?" And I want to tell you it's what we've been avoiding getting to, which is why I'm jumping right in. They were suspicious of Amanda because of the fresh look that she would have at their rituals. Perhaps for them, their ritual had become rote or boring. Amanda might come along and ask them some questions. might find out they had a conflict they had not resolved, or an incident of sexual abuse or misconduct that they were still keeping secret. Seeing Amanda painfully reminded the older members that their children and grandchildren had long ago abandoned the institutional church. They felt shame about this, and not being able to meet Amanda's needs, the shame passed to her and back again to them. And this is all too often our congregational landscape. I'd like you to say it with me. This is our overall theme: decrease shame and increase grace. No matter how wonderful your programs are, no matter how many people we have in worship, no matter how far our outreach stretches into the community, perfectionism and shame block our ability to grow and thrive. I found this painting in a cathedral in Italy. So I kind of want you to dim the lights so we can see it. Do you see this guy with his finger pointing at us? How many of you know someone who doesn't go to church because this is what they expect to experience? What do you think he's saying? Now, oh, thank you. That's amazing. The power of the preacher's office. There he is pointing his finger at us. What is he saying, do you think? Shame on you. What else? A reprimand. You should be ashamed of yourself. In the aftermath of several notorious cases of misconduct in one denomination, a minister told me, "We have become a community of the shamed and the ashamed." Shame is a uniquely theological and emotional condition. I define shame as a feeling of unworthiness in the sight of God or significant others. It is a uniquely theological emotion. It is not the same as guilt, and we get this mixed up a lot. Though people use those terms interchangeably, they are very different, because guilt says, and however the power turned down the lights, you may turn them up again in case people are taking notes. Guilt says, I made a mistake, and is corrected and correctable. Because you can change a behavior, you can change a word or a comment. If you violate your own code of operating values, you can change and correct that. And that's what guilt is there for. It's to evoke that kind of reminder, oops. And then we change our behavior. But shame becomes, I am a mistake. And with shame, people take those behavioral problems and lump them into the core of their sense of being. And so, perhaps because I sin, I am a sinner. Now I know that I'm getting into dangerous theological waters here. But in the field of mental health, we no longer say someone is an addict. We say this is a person with an addiction. We don't say he's a schizophrenic. We say he has a brain condition and he has the condition, the disease of schizophrenia. And yet every Sunday morning we still say that we have people who sin. Oh, I knew I'd get off track already. And then we say they're sinners. And once you think that your behavior makes you unworthy in the sight of God, what's the point of stopping it? You are already broken in your relationship with God, and therefore you have a justification to continue in that broken behavior. That's part of the insidiousness of the difference here, and we need to understand it. Guilt is I made a mistake. Shame is I am a mistake. The good news in that is that grace is the only way to get that shame eradicated at a very, very deep level. And so we have that gift in the church as well. Shame is more difficult to heal because it draws self-annihilating conclusions. Shame says that because of some unacceptable thought or behavior or something sinful that we engaged in, we are utterly unworthy to have anyone's love, including the love of God. So while forgiveness handles the problem of guilt, only grace handles the problem of shame. And long after our teams come into congregations and our cases are resolved, we have the problem of lingering, unhealed shame. In a shame-based system, bad actions become bad character, and bad thoughts equal bad persons. But in a grace-based system, bad acts do not make you unacceptable. You cannot erase your child of God status. I was talking about this in a conference once, and a man stood up in the back and he said, I really want to understand this. I think this is something new to me. And he said, but what if my grandson really is a jerk? You see how we love labeling? And I said, then you say to that grandson, you are a child of God. Why is it that you're behaving like a jerk? Do you see the difference? Shame is only healed by grace. As United Methodists, we have a legacy of grace. John Wesley, oh my gosh, why did I become Methodist in seminary? I started as a Presbyterian. I still visit there sometimes. The shame. But it's John Wesley who compels us with the salvation by grace theme, our healing and our sanctification through grace. With Wesley, we even have prevenient grace. It's grace before you even know you've got grace. I love it. And we say in that ritual of membership that the congregation of the United Methodist Church is the place, the means of grace, which the church alone supplies. We claim a lot, don't we? If grace is the powerful antidote for shame, why is it in the past few decades we are seeing an increase in our shame? Because we have a decline in the gap between who we thought we should have been, or who we were in the 50s, or who we should be now, or who we think we should be in the future, or who the evangelicals next door to us are. We have comparison shame forward and backward through time, and as we look around us, it's not serving us well. But shame is also the lingering emotion of abuse. Lasting for years and decades, it'll pass from one generation to another. I recently learned of a congregation where the founding father felt it was his right and privilege to introduce adolescent daughters to the pleasures of sex. This took place nearly 3 generations back, but the grandchildren have now come forward to talk about it. By our own statistics through the Commission of Status and Role of Women, and you've heard us talk about the numbers of people in our congregations who are survivors and who are abuse victims, I am guessing that 1 in 5 clergy, I'm sorry, I have my numbers totally backward, 50% of our clergy have encountered sexual abuse in their lives. We know 1 in 3 women in the culture by the age of 25 has been sexually molested or abused. We also know the high likelihood that women are harassed in the church by Cosro's statistics, 70–80% by the Faith Trust Institute studies. We have huge numbers of clergy who are abuse survivors, and from my view, many are carrying the legacy and lingering feelings of shame. If clergy have not healed from their own abuse experiences, they are more likely to be silent and to cover up the abuses of others. They are also likely to be silent when boundaries are crossed against them. When individuals in congregations are critical, cruel, or harass clergy, many of us are ill-prepared to push through the layers of shame which accompany these behaviors in order to confront them and stop them. Some of you will understand this. Abuse survivors are taught to be nice. I spoke as a consultant on the phone recently with a pastor who said, "I have such a nice congregation." And I said, "I hope you will get over that." We have learned to be polite, to minimize problems. The fact that very few clergy, superintendents, or bishops file charges against harassing laity is evidence of my point. How many of you have used the Book of Discipline to file a charge against a lay person's harassment? I've got maybe 4 or 5 hands. We're making progress. Thank you. We must challenge clergy who cooperate in minimization and secret keeping. We must support shame recovery at all levels and expect our clergy to engage in shame recovery as well. Because shameless leaders create shameless congregations. When abuse takes place, everyone in the congregational system takes on shame. Perpetrators have shame about their behavior, though it is deeply hidden under masks of denial and narcissism. Perpetrators may claim to be victims of the persons they abuse, or those who caught them, or those who filed charges against them, or those who are superintendents, bishops, or the whole kit and caboodle of the church. When they deny responsibilities for their actions, others will pick up and carry the shame. Whole congregations end up with the shame which is disowned by these perpetrators. The perpetrators disown their shame, and also it is picked up by their victims. The shame is increased when victims are silenced by congregations, judicatory leaders, or lawyers in financial settlements. Victims experience these things as violations of trust, and they feel they cannot trust themselves. Harassment and abuse lead victims to conclude that they are totally unworthy of love and of communion with God. When Scott was a teenager, I'll call him Scott, in his youth group, he was at that creative and innocent age when spiritual and sexual romanticism flourish. He was singled out among his peers to meet with the pastor to design programs and retreats. He was admired for his young leadership skills. While at home, Scott's father was drinking and out late at night. His mother and father were fighting about money and the drinking. The church was a safer place to hang out, or so he thought, and so thought his mother, who encouraged him to go there to meet with his pastor. And he met more and more frequently with the pastor who taught him to trust, and the pastor who taught him to know his intimate detail about life and then about sexuality as he engaged in it with Scott. The incidents were pleasurable and horrible at the same time. And it took Scott 40 years to step inside of a counseling office to begin to sort that out. Meanwhile, he had been carrying the emotion of shame. It invaded his work life. It kept him from advancing his career. It limited his intimacy with his wife and his family. And it kept him from being close to anyone because what he kept thinking in his head was unworthy, 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 which he compensated for nicely with codependency, overwork, and service to the church. This is the lingering legacy of shame. When the congregation where this abuse took place was told of these incidents, they realized the impact this secret had had over time. They had carried a lingering legacy of shame. And now you're saying, well, how could they have known about it? It was floating in the unconscious dynamic of the relationships within the congregation. And so I'm going to talk to you now about 4 identifying characteristics of shame, and there are many more, but time will not permit, as they linger in the congregation following abuse. These are after effects, and they are also the characteristics likely to contribute to ongoing secrets and abuses. They are blame, secret keeping, perfectionism, and narcissism. First, let's look at blame. Following incidents of clergy sexual abuse, what do you hear? Why didn't we have policies in place? Why didn't we stop it? Why couldn't we see it coming? We should have known. This is the exacerbated cry of someone who missed abuse. Or when observing things, that stuff that is uncomfortable in your intuition, you brushed it away or denied it or ignored it. I presented a workshop to a congregation with a 3rd incident of sexual misconduct. The new supply pastor invited me to come, but lay leaders were very resistant, and finally I engaged them on the phone before coming. And here's the first thing they said: please don't come and blame us for what happened here. Why did they expect blame? Because it is the opposite of shame. What they felt was shame, and how they expressed it was that I would blame them or the inclination to blame others. Blame being disowned shame. And you know how quickly blame can spread. Some of you grew up in families who were quite good at that. I had to reassure them that I wasn't coming to blame them, that I, in fact, had great compassion for them. It was the first time anyone told them that they were victims of these incidents of abuse. It was only when they had their shame reduced by grace that they could eventually come to acknowledge the system's dynamics which had contributed to the abuse pattern. The second characteristic is secret keeping. And I put this up because it's always quite fun, you know, the don't tell grandma, it'll kill grandma syndrome. Which is what protects us from our shame. It's not really grandma we're worried about. In fact, most grandmas go, okay, I knew you were gay, let's make cookies like we always did. But like children in family systems with alcoholism, an affair, a non-disclosed homosexual, or a gambling or addiction problem, congregants know something is amiss even without having the facts. In fact, the less facts they have, the more they'll make it up, and it gets juicier by gossip. New visitors have a palpable experience coming into that something is wrong, especially new visitors who have healed of their own shame. And in short order, they notice that everyone is relating to each other only on the surface, and if they speak the truth, silence and suspicion. They learn that sexual topics are not talked about because if you are keeping secrets about sexuality, then talking about any aspect of it is likely to reveal the truths. You will not find new healthy leaders in congregations with undisclosed secrets, because those in power who know are not on equal footing with those who do not or never will. And leaders accustomed to old secrets will likely go on keeping new ones. Sexual secrets are undermining the health and vitality of our congregations because they are surrounding the emotion of shame. Our don't ask, don't tell policy is particularly damaging in this way. The silence promotes secret keeping and places stigma and shame on clergy who wish to have partnerships of love and transparency. The other problem with this continuing dynamic is that I went to be trained as a ministerial assessment specialist with the psychologists in our country who are under the United Methodist umbrella and are doing psychological evaluations for clergy candidates. And I'll tell you that during the training, it was never mentioned what we should do in asking questions about sexuality. And in fact, when I raised the question, what do you think happened? Silence and suspicion. Shame, thank you. A psychosexual history is altogether being avoided in our evaluations of clergy candidates because of this don't ask, don't tell issue. And what it means is that we are not able to identify individuals with unhealed sexual wounds, sexual addictions, and compulsions or other sexual problems which need to be identified and healed prior to ordination. The systemic problem at the congregational level is that our congregations with gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transgendered clergy end up carrying, unwittingly sometimes, and with full knowledge other times, carrying a shame-evoking, because of our culture, shame-evoking secret. And the shame appears in the hiding and in the information management of that secret, and congregations are entirely busy with all the information management and shame avoidance strategies that are involved in that kind of secret management. They do not address, heal, or eliminate shame because only truth-telling and transparency eliminate shame. I think I have it up here again. Oh, no, we don't. We need to be what? Shameless. The third characteristic of shame is perfectionism. There are some things we wish Jesus had not said. Only a few. Or we had not misinterpreted, in this case, actually. What Jesus said is interpreted in our scriptures as, "Be ye perfect." Luckily, the word in Greek more closely translates into the word whole or wholeness. Be well, be healthy. Do not try for perfection. Now, when clergy are ordained, we say that we expect to be made perfect in love in our lifetime and that we are going on to perfection. But even Wesley experienced and confessed that he knew very few people who had achieved it. Shame sneaks in between who we are and who we think we ought to be. And many clergy will set the bar way too high. They set it right about here, okay? And then the parishioners come along, what do? They go. They set it even higher for us. And the space between who we know ourselves to be and who we think we have to be is the space where shame grows. It's time to realize that God needs our wholeness more than our perfection. You have heard this before, so I'll go over it quite briefly, but you know, it went around on the internet and it's fun and laughter is good for us. The perfect pastor preaches only 10 minutes, condemns sin roundly but never hurts anyone's feelings, works from 8 in the morning until midnight, is also the church janitor, 29 years old with 40 years of experience, burning desire to work with teenagers, but spends all day long at senior citizens' homes. Perfect pastor smiles all the time, but is seriously committed. I don't know, committed to what? The perfect pastor makes 15 home visits a day, but is always at the church office when needed. Well, you know. So instead of perfect pastors, what we need is shameless pastors. We need pastors who can make mistakes without going to that place of shame, can say, this was a mess up. I have royally messed this up, without going to this place of I am therefore unworthy in the sight of God, or the place of I will be more God-like, I will ignore the imperfection, and you and I can reflect our gloriousness together. Which takes me to the fourth characteristic. Narcissism is a shame-avoiding strategy, a little different than perfection. Narcissism is based on the Greek god who went looking for love in all the wrong places, and looking in a pool of water saw his reflection there and fell in love with himself. I kind of wish someone had been behind him and just nudged him right on into that. What narcissism is about is actually a cover-up for a deeply shamed individual. Because if you're deeply, deeply shamed about who you are at the core and you think you're unworthy at the core and that you're broken from God, what are you going to do? You're going to go to seminary. Clergy, in terms of personality disorders on the MMPI, come up higher on narcissism than any other personality disorder. Are we surprised? The problem is that narcissistic clergy are hired by narcissistic congregations. And they're the ones who call the bishop and say, we'd like to lobby to get that person in our church because we think it'd be a good fit, because we want to have the best of everything. And we're going to be the best at providing programs in the community. We're going to be the best for everything. We're going to have a hall in which we put up the pictures of all those old white men. Well, hopefully, I mean, some of your congregations, all those leaders. But you know, and they call that the Hall of Fame, but I went to a church where 3 of those clergy had crossed sexual boundaries, and those pictures are still hanging in the hallway on the way to the sanctuary. No, I'm not making this up. And I said, you have a hall of shame, not a hall of fame. Get those pictures down and take pictures of your new babies and your pregnant folks and your diversity and get them up on the walls. What are you doing here? Let's not keep shame as evident as this. Well, anyway, wearing the mask of Christian righteousness, the congregation and the pastor can work together, and this sets the stage for abuses of power. It is dangerous and volatile, and as you know, even the brightest and the best can fall, and they do, under the pressure of presumed holiness, while underneath that, if you hear someone say, if they only knew who I really was, that's the person you need to call forth into healing, therapy, consultation, time away. Well, I have to say here, a little footnote is that part of the problem is our conference leaders, bishops, and superintendents can engage in these shame avoidance strategies. Keeping things under wraps, hiring lawyers who support them in trying to protect the institution, keeping shame from public view takes up our time and our resources. I was describing that a letter went out to all the pastors in one of our annual conferences, and it had a confidential sticker, not a sticker, but a stamp, a red stamp, on it that was so big they couldn't put it the sideways on an 8.5. They had to put it at an angle. And it said confidential, and 300 of them went out in the mail. And all the victim in that annual conference wanted was for the churches where abuse had taken place to be aware that they have other victims likely to be in their pews. That's really all that was wanted. Now, they lost a lot of millions of dollars, but that's what the victim wanted. We have to be careful with that word confidential, and my new book on information can help you with that. That was limited access, not even very limited. What we've got to have is transparency and accountability, because whole conferences are hiding their histories in order to protect themselves. And it is time that we change the culture of secrecy in which our shame hides. Sometimes it takes these huge financial settlements to move us forward. But I know of one annual conference where that happened, and well, several actually. And in the settlement itself, the conference provides funds for these services. So when people say to me, I don't know if we can afford to bring you, I said, how does a $1.3 million lawsuit sound instead? We have to take the shame and replace it with grace. We are safest in congregations that address and eliminate shame, because finger pointing and blaming and identifying individuals as the problem is prolonging our march toward death. We cannot heal this problem with blame. We cannot keep secrets under the guise of confidentiality. We cannot heal congregations or wounded people without full transparency. And if we work hard to achieve some idealized saintliness, it will also fail us in the end. Making ourselves look better than we are just doesn't work. So what do we need to do? I can only begin to give you what I'm going to spell out quite extensively over the next few months on grace, replacing shame with grace. Accept the congregation's whole story as the story of pain and survivorship that it is. And tell that story with humility, but not humiliation. Find the lingering shame spots and talk openly about them. Consider reparation for victims within and beyond the congregation. Now, if our country can do this, for those whose lands we've stolen and those whose property we stole and those who we sent to camps, can't our churches find those who have left and start making reparation to them for the damage that they've experienced in our congregations? I hope we will find a way for that. Avoid at all cost placing blame or shame on anyone. This is going to be a little tricky, including perpetrators, because it is perpetrators' shame that is adding to their defensiveness and their blame dynamic with us. proclaim, as Professor Torres so well stated for us, the goodness of sexuality and intimacy within the context of honesty, fidelity, and covenant making. And let ethical sexuality trump legalism, because legalism is what is reinforcing shame. Stop engaging in any of those 4 characteristics that we've described: blame, perfectionism, secrecy, or narcissism. And challenge other people to let go of those things as well. In short, shame less, less abuse. The shame-less congregation will have replaced its shame with grace. I don't mean grace here as cheap forgiveness. I don't mean grace that looks the other way. That's codependency. I mean a grace that looks at it with honesty and transparency, that asks for healthy change and expects loving behavior. Grace that says we are capable of healthy, loving relationships and calls us to hold each other accountable for those. As St. Paul has said, the surpassing grace of God is given to you. Thanks be to God for this indescribable gift. One closing story for you. I was in church one Sunday morning and the choir started up in the front. This is a grace-based church, and I want to make sure we end with some grace notes. And there's the choir up front, and they're in their robes, and choir director stands up, and they start to sing, and they were obviously not in sync. The altos started, but the men came in some other beat to rhythm, and they plowed ahead for a few bars, and their faces became flushed, and they had that shame look. They started to kind of crumble, and they were distorted, and their shoulders were drooping, and their shallow breathing was evident. And the choir director waved her hands to stop the pianist and looked up at them. And we all held our breaths, because we've been in shame-based churches, and we feel like children about to be scolded, right? What would be said? She could have sighed and said, I've heard this happen. A pastor said this after we were singing a hymn one Sunday morning. Well, let's try that again. Like it wasn't good enough. She could have exposed her frustration and their failure, but she said instead, I want to start over, because at rehearsal, I heard you sing this beautifully. And they stood up taller, and they breathed more deeply, and they smiled, and it went off without a hitch. They were singing from a place of grace. They were grace-filled singers led by a grace-filled leader. And that's what I encourage you to be, a grace-filled leader.